17-year-old Zoe Chun stepped off the school bus wearing full military camouflage, her combat boots echoing against the concrete as whispers erupted around her like wildfire. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lincoln High's parking lot, but nothing could hide the stares that followed her every step. Is she seriously wearing that to homecoming week? Madison Torres, the student body president with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and designer everything, laughed loudly, enough for half the parking lot to hear. Her voice carried that particular tone of disbelief mixed with superiority that only came naturally to those who had never questioned their place in the social hierarchy. Within minutes, phones were out and photos of Zoe were already circulating. On social media, the captions came fast and merciless. "Wannabe soldier girl. Dress-up day isn't until Friday," and "someone's having an identity crisis." Zoe could practically feel the notifications pinging across the school's invisible network as her image spread from phone to phone, each share adding another layer to her humiliation. Her jaw tightened as she walked past a group of football players who had gathered near their lifted trucks, their Letterman jackets gleaming in the morning light. Jake Morrison, the quarterback whose ego was somehow larger than his already considerable frame, nudged his teammates and started marching in exaggerated formation behind her. "Left, right," he called out in a mocking drill sergeant voice, while his friends saluted with theatrical precision. "10 hot. We've got ourselves a real soldier here, boys." The laughter that followed felt like needles against Zoe's skin, but she kept walking, her spine straight and her eyes forward. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only made things worse. The oversized camouflage jacket hung loose on her small frame, the sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that trembled slightly despite her outward composure. The fabric still carried the faintest scent of her father's cologne, a detail that both comforted and broke her heart every time she wore it. She transferred to Lincoln High just 2 months ago, when her mom got remarried to a kind but quiet man named Robert, who worked in insurance. The move had been necessary. Her mother couldn't bear staying in their old town, where every street corner held memories of David Chun. But starting over at a new school during senior year was like trying to join a movie halfway through. Everyone already knew their roles, their groups, their place in the carefully constructed social ecosystem. This was exactly the kind of attention Zoe had hoped to avoid. She'd planned to fly under the radar, graduate quietly, and move on to college where she could start fresh once again. But today wasn't about fitting in or making friends or navigating the treacherous waters of high school politics. Today marked 3 years since the worst day of her life, and wearing her father's uniform was the only way she could feel close to him. The only ritual that made the crushing weight of his absence bearable. As she approached the main building, more students began to notice her unusual attire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to track her movement. Some pointed openly, while others whispered behind cupped hands. A group of theater kids near the drama department entrance started an impromptu performance, pretending to duck for cover and shouting, "Incoming," with dramatic flair. Even the typically indifferent seniors, who usually couldn't be bothered to notice underclassmen, were pulling out their phones to capture what they clearly saw as the morning's entertainment. Zoe's locker was located in the most trafficked hallway of the school, a cruel twist of fate that meant her daily routine involved running a gauntlet of judgment. As she reached the familiar blue metal door, her heart sank. Someone had already been there before her. A handwritten note was taped to the locker. The words, "G.I. Jane wants attention," scrawled in thick black marker across notebook paper. The handwriting was deliberately messy, designed to hide the author's identity, but the cruelty was crystal clear. She ripped the note down with more force than necessary, crumpling it in her fist as students continued to stream past, many slowing their pace to get a better look at the girl in camouflage who had somehow become the morning's main attraction. Her combination lock felt slippery under her sweaty fingers as she tried to open it, the numbers blurring slightly as tears threatened to form in the corners of her eyes. "Nice costume," a voice said behind her. Zoe turned to see Ashley Kim, a girl from her AP history class who had always seemed relatively normal compared to the social media-obsessed masses. But even Ashley's tone carried a note of bewildered amusement, as if Zoe were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Is this for some kind of project or something?" Zoe finally got her locker open and began pulling out her books for first period, her movements mechanical and precise. "Something like that," she replied quietly, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and too personal to share with someone who was essentially a stranger. As the first bell rang and students began their reluctant migration toward classrooms, Zoe caught her reflection in the small mirror she'd hung inside her locker door. Her father's dog tags hung around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of his old uniform shirt. In the reflection, she could almost see him standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice telling her to stand tall and be proud. But when she blinked, there was only the bustling hallway and the weight of 100 curious stares. By third period, the harassment had evolved from casual mockery into something more deliberate and cruel. Zoe's chemistry class was typically her refuge, a place where equations and formulas provided clear, logical answers in a world that often made no sense. But today, even the sanctuary of science couldn't protect her from the growing storm of attention her uniform had attracted. She slid into her usual seat at the back of the classroom, hoping to blend into the background. But Tyler Brooks had other plans. Tyler was the kind of student who thrived on chaos, a class clown whose humor often crossed the line into cruelty. He'd been watching Zoe all morning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and chemistry class provided the ideal stage for his performance. As Mrs. Patterson began explaining molecular structures on the whiteboard, Tyler made his move. He stood up abruptly, claiming he needed to sharpen his pencil, but instead took a deliberately circuitous route that brought him directly past Zoe's desk. With theatrical precision, he accidentally knocked her textbook, notebook, and pencil case to the floor with a sweeping gesture of his arm. "Oops," he said loudly, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Sorry about that ... explosion." He made exaggerated sound effects, boom, kaboom, while gesturing wildly with his hands, mimicking the chaos of a battlefield. The timing was perfect. Mrs. Patterson had her back turned, writing formulas on the board, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding behind her. The class erupted in barely contained laughter. Students covered their mouths with their hands, their shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Some weren't even trying to hide their amusement, openly pointing and whispering to their neighbors. Zoe's face burned with humiliation as she bent down to collect her scattered belongings, her father's oversized sleeves making the simple task awkward and clumsy. "Careful there, soldier," Tyler whispered as he leaned down, pretending to help while actually making things worse by kicking her pencil further under the desk. "Wouldn't want you to call in an airstrike on the chemistry lab." His voice was just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear, and another wave of snickers rippled through the classroom. Zoe's hands clenched into fists as she straightened up, her knuckles white against the faded green fabric of her father's uniform. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to defend herself, to make Tyler pay for his cruelty. But she'd learned long ago that retaliation only made things worse, only gave bullies more ammunition to use against her. So she said nothing, simply returned to her seat and tried to focus on Mrs. Patterson's lesson about chemical bonds. Though the words seemed to float meaninglessly in the air, the whispers continued throughout the period, a constant undercurrent of judgment and speculation. Why is she dressed like that? Is she trying to be edgy? Maybe she's having some kind of breakdown. Each comment felt like a small cut, and by the time the bell rang, Zoe felt like she was bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Lunch period brought no relief. The cafeteria was a social minefield on the best of days, but today it felt like walking into enemy territory. Zoe grabbed a tray and moved through the lunch line, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her every step. The lunch. Ladies gave her curious looks but said nothing, though she caught one of them nudging another and pointing in her direction. She found an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria, as far from the popular kids' territory as possible. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It protected her from direct confrontation, but also made her a more obvious target. Sitting alone in her military uniform, like a beacon of otherness in a sea of conformity. For a few precious minutes, she thought she might make it through lunch unscathed. She picked at her sandwich, not really tasting it, while trying to ignore the periodic bursts of laughter from nearby tables that she was certain were directed at her. But her peace was short-lived. Madison Torres appeared at her table like a perfectly manicured storm cloud, flanked by her usual entourage of followers. Brittany Walsh and Chloe Martinez stood slightly behind their leader, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed cruelty. These were the girls who ruled Lincoln High's social hierarchy with iron fists wrapped in designer gloves, and they'd clearly decided that Zoe's uniform was a challenge to their authority. "Look, military girl," Madison began, her voice carrying that particular tone of fake concern that popular girls had perfected over generations. She slid into the seat across from Zoe without invitation, her perfectly applied makeup and strategically tousled hair a stark contrast to Zoe's bare face and simple ponytail. "We get that you're trying to be edgy or whatever, but this whole costume thing is getting really old." The cafeteria around them had begun to quiet, conversations dying as students sensed drama brewing. Phones appeared as if by magic, held discreetly, but ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. This was better than reality TV. This was real-time high school warfare, and everyone wanted a front-row seat. "Maybe you should try shopping at normal stores instead of army surplus?" Brittany added with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I mean, there are so many cute boutiques in town. We could totally take you shopping sometime." The offer was delivered with such obvious insincerity that it felt more like an insult than an invitation. Chloe nodded enthusiastically, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining something to a small child. "Yeah, like, we're not trying to be mean or anything, but you're kind of making everyone uncomfortable. It's like you're trying too hard to be different, you know?" Zoe's grip tightened on her plastic fork until her knuckles went white. The cafeteria had gone almost completely silent now. Hundreds of eyes focused on their table like spectators at a gladiator match. She could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the hungry anticipation of students who smelled blood in the water. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but her eyes blazed with an intensity that made Madison's confident smirk falter slightly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Zoe said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous. Something that suggested depths these girls couldn't begin to fathom. Madison's smirk returned, emboldened by her audience and her own sense of social invincibility. She leaned back in her chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for her cruelty. "Oh, please," she said, her voice rising to ensure everyone in the cafeteria could hear. "What are you going to do? Call your daddy to come save you?" The words hit Zoe like a physical blow, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Just as Zoe opened her mouth to respond, her lips parting to deliver words that would either destroy her completely or finally reveal the truth she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest. A sound unlike anything Lincoln High had ever experienced shattered the tense silence. It started as a distant rumble, barely perceptible beneath the cafeteria's fluorescent hum, but within seconds it grew into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The cafeteria. Windows rattled violently in their frames, causing several students to instinctively duck under their tables. Lunch trays clattered to the floor as the thunderous noise grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside everyone's chest. Madison's confident smirk vanished as she looked around wildly, her perfectly styled hair whipping around her face as she tried to locate the source of the overwhelming noise. "What the hell is that?" Tyler Brooks shouted over the din, but his voice was barely audible above the mechanical roar that now dominated every other sound. The overhead lights flickered ominously, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes crashed to the floor as the entire building seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity through the large windows that lined the cafeteria's east wall. A massive shadow passed overhead, blocking out the afternoon sun and plunging the room into temporary darkness. Students pressed their faces against the glass, phones already out and recording, as a sight that belonged in war movies rather than suburban high schools materialized above them. A Black Hawk helicopter, its rotors churning the air into a visible maelstrom, appeared over the school like something from another world. The aircraft was enormous, its olive green hull gleaming in the sunlight as it circled the building with military precision. The distinctive whop-whop of its rotors created a rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of every person watching from below. "Holy shit," someone whispered, though the words were lost in the overwhelming noise. "Is that actually happening?" The helicopter completed one full circle around Lincoln High before banking sharply toward the football field. Students abandoned their lunches without a second thought, chairs scraping and falling as hundreds of teenagers rushed toward the windows and exits. Teachers tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order, but even they were craning their necks and pulling out their phones to capture the unprecedented scene unfolding outside. "Everyone stay calm." Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely audible as she tried to corral her students, but her own eyes were wide with amazement as she watched the military aircraft descend toward the 50-yard line. "Please remain in your seats." But her words fell on deaf ears. The cafeteria had erupted into controlled chaos as students pushed toward the exits, desperate to get outside and witness whatever was happening on the football field. Madison and her crew were swept along with the crowd, their earlier confidence replaced by confusion and a growing sense that they had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple lunch period confrontation. Zoe remained frozen at her table, watching the helicopter through the window as it settled onto the football field with practiced precision. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands trembled as recognition dawned. She knew that aircraft, knew the unit markings painted on its side, knew exactly why it was here and what it meant. The helicopter's engines began to wind down, but the rotors continued spinning as figures in military dress uniforms emerged from the aircraft. Even from a distance, Zoe could make out the crisp lines of their formal attire, the gleam of polished brass and ribbons that told stories of service and sacrifice. A breath caught in her throat as she recognized one of the figures stepping onto the field, tall, authoritative, with silver hair visible beneath her military cap. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, her father's former commanding officer, the woman who had delivered the news that changed Zoe's life forever 3 years ago. Principal Williams' voice crackled over the intercom system, cutting through the excited chatter and speculation that filled the hallways. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by barely controlled amazement as he made an announcement that would be remembered long after graduation day. "Attention students and faculty," his voice echoed through the building. competing with the still spinning helicopter rotors outside. We have an unusual situation developing on our campus. Zoe Chun, please report to the main office immediately. I repeat, Zoe Chun to the main office. The announcement hit the crowd like an electric shock. Hundreds of heads turned toward Zoe, who was still standing motionless in the cafeteria, her father's oversized uniform suddenly feeling both too big and too small at the same time. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Zoe Chun? Who's that? The girl in the army clothes. What did she do? Is she in trouble? Why is the military here for her? Madison's face had gone pale, her earlier bravado evaporating as the implications of the situation began to sink in. The girl she had been mocking, the target of her cruel jokes about calling her daddy, was somehow connected to the military helicopter that had just landed on their school's football field. Tyler Brooks looked like he might be sick, his face a sickly green color as he realized that his battlefield sound effects and explosion jokes might have been directed at someone with actual military connections. As Zoe began walking toward the main office, the crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. Students who had been laughing at her just minutes before now watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every step of her journey through the hallways. The combat boots that had seemed so out of place that morning now sounded different. Against the linoleum floor, not awkward or attention-seeking, but purposeful, meaningful. Teachers emerged from their classrooms, drawn by the commotion and the continuing sound of helicopter rotors outside. Even the most jaded faculty members, those who had seen everything in their decades of education, stood in doorways with expressions of amazement and curiosity. This was unprecedented, extraordinary, the kind of event that would be talked about for years to come. Through the windows that lined the main hallway, Zoe could see more military personnel emerging from the helicopter. They moved with the precise, coordinated efficiency of people accustomed to ceremony and protocol. A small crowd of soldiers formed on the football field, their dress uniforms immaculate despite the wind from the still spinning rotors. Madison and her friends followed at a distance, no longer the confident queens of the school, but uncertain observers of something they didn't understand. Their earlier mockery had been replaced by a growing sense of dread, a realization that they might have made a terrible mistake. The girl they had dismissed as attention-seeking was walking toward a meeting with military officials who had arrived by helicopter, and the implications of that fact were beginning to dawn on them. What do you think is happening? Brittany whispered to Madison, her voice small and uncertain. Madison didn't answer. She couldn't answer. For the first time in her high school career, she was completely out of her depth, watching events unfold that were beyond her understanding or control. The social hierarchy that had seemed so important just minutes before suddenly felt trivial and meaningless in the face of whatever was happening on the football field. As Zoe approached the main office, she could see Colonel Mitchell through the window, standing tall and dignified in her dress uniform. The woman who had been present for the worst moment of Zoe's life was here, in her high school, carrying something that would change everything once again. The entire school had gathered on the football field in a scene that defied every rule and protocol Lincoln High had ever established. What had started as curious students sneaking out of classrooms had become a mass exodus as teachers, administrators, and even cafeteria workers joined the unprecedented assembly. The Black Hawk helicopter sat like a sleeping giant on the 50-yard line, its rotors finally still, but its presence commanding absolute attention from the nearly 2,000 people who now formed a massive semicircle around the aircraft. Principal Williams stood nervously beside Colonel Sarah Mitchell, his usual authority diminished in the presence of the decorated military officer whose chest displayed ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of service and sacrifice. The colonel's silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun beneath her dress cap, and her bearing radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from leading soldiers. Through impossible situations, Zoe emerged from the school building flanked by two junior officers, their polished shoes clicking in perfect synchronization against the concrete walkway that led to the field. The crowd parted before them like a living curtain, hundreds of faces turning to track her movement with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe to dawning comprehension. The girl who had been mocked and ridiculed just hours before now walked with the dignity of someone being escorted to receive the highest honors. Madison Torres stood frozen near the bleachers, her face ashen as she watched the procession. The cruel words she had spoken in the cafeteria, "Call your daddy to come," "Save you," echoed in her mind like a curse. Beside her, Tyler Brooks looked like he might collapse, his earlier jokes about explosions and airstrikes now seeming not just inappropriate, but potentially devastating in their cruelty. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward as Zoe approached, her voice carrying clearly across the silent field through a portable microphone that one of her aides had quickly set up. The sound system crackled to life, and when she spoke, her words reached every corner of the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty of Lincoln High School," she began, her voice steady and commanding. 3 years ago today, on October 15th, Staff Sergeant David Chun made the ultimate sacrifice while serving his country in Afghanistan. He died saving 12 members of his unit when their convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the magnitude of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't a drill or a demonstration or some kind of educational program. This was real, personal, and heartbreaking in ways that most of these teenagers had never experienced. Colonel Mitchell continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about a man she had clearly respected and admired. Sergeant Chen was a communications specialist, a father, and a hero who put the lives of his fellow soldiers above his own safety. When the convoy came under heavy fire, he left the relative safety of his armored vehicle to establish a communication link that would bring rescue to his trapped comrades. He was killed by sniper fire while completing that mission, but his actions saved 12 lives. Zoe stood at attention beside the colonel, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the story she knew by heart but had never heard told to such an audience. Her father's dog tags felt heavy against her chest, and the oversized uniform that had seemed so awkward that morning now felt like armor, protecting her from the weight of everyone's stares. His daughter Zoe, the colonel gestured toward her, has honored his memory every year on this date by wearing his uniform. She has carried his legacy with quiet dignity, never seeking attention or recognition, simply remembering a father who died serving something greater than himself. The silence on the field was absolute now, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the occasional sniffle from someone in the crowd. Even the most cynical seniors, the ones who prided themselves on being too cool to care about anything, stood transfixed by the unfolding ceremony. Colonel Mitchell reached into a wooden presentation case that one of her aides held open. From it, she withdrew a folded American flag, its red, white, and blue fabric crisp and perfect, and a smaller wooden box that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Today, we are here to present Zoe with 2 items that have been a long time coming, the colonel announced. First, this flag, which flew over the forward operating base where her father served and died. It was lowered to half-staff in his honor and has been waiting for the right moment to be presented to his family. She placed the flag in Zoe's trembling hands, the weight of it somehow both lighter and heavier than she had expected. The fabric was soft but substantial, and she could almost feel the history it carried, the lives it represented, the sacrifices it symbolized. And second, Colonel Mitchell opened the wooden box to reveal a medal that caught the sunlight and seemed to radiate its own inner light. The Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, which was posthumously awarded to staff Sergeant David Chun for his extraordinary heroism and selfless sacrifice. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the casual clapping of a school assembly. This was something deeper, more reverent, the kind of applause reserved for moments that transcended ordinary experience. Students who had never given a thought to military service found themselves wiping away tears, while teachers who had seen decades of graduations and ceremonies stood in awe of something unprecedented. As Colonel Mitchell pinned the medal to Zoe's uniform, her father's uniform, she leaned close and whispered something that only Zoe could hear. "He would be so proud of the woman you've become. His courage lives on in you." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. 2,000 people standing together in honor of a man most of them had never heard of until that day. When it ended, the spell was broken, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of Lincoln High School. Tyler Brooks was the first to approach Zoe as the crowd began to disperse. His face was streaked with tears, and his voice shook as he spoke. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Your dad... He was a real hero. I didn't know. I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I did." Zoe looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the class clown who had tormented her, but a 17-year-old boy who had just learned something profound about consequences and respect. "He was," she said simply. "And now you know why I wear this uniform, not for attention, but to remember that heroes are real, and sometimes they're closer than you think." Madison approached next, her usual confidence completely shattered. The girl who had ruled the school's social hierarchy with casual cruelty now looked small and lost. "Zoe, she started, then stopped, seemingly unable to find words adequate to the moment. "I said terrible things about your father. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Zoe replied, but her voice held no anger, only a quiet sadness. "You saw someone different and decided that made them a target. Maybe next time you'll think about what you don't know before you decide to hurt someone." As the helicopter prepared for departure, its rotors spinning up once again, students began to understand that they had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The girl in camouflage was no longer a target for mockery, but a reminder that everyone carries stories, that heroism exists in the real world, and that sometimes the people we dismiss or ignore are connected to something far greater than high school social hierarchies. Zoe stood on the field long after the Black Hawk had disappeared into the afternoon sky, clutching her father's Medal of Honor and feeling his presence more strongly than she had since the day he died. Around her, Lincoln High School was forever changed, and she knew that when she wore his uniform again, it would be with the understanding and respect it had always deserved. The story would spread beyond the school, beyond the town, becoming a reminder that heroes' children walk among us, carrying their parents' legacy with quiet dignity until the moment comes for that legacy to shine.